I came home expecting nothing more than the usual evening routine, maybe leftover soup reheated in the microwave, the soft murmur of the television in the living room, and my husband's gentle snoring from his favorite armchair. After 3 days away caring for Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman whose children lived too far to visit, I was bone-tired but grateful to be back in my own space. At 60, I thought I knew what to expect from my life, from my family, from the rhythms we'd built over decades of marriage and parenthood. But the moment I turned my key in the front door, I knew something was terribly wrong. The house felt different, not just quiet, but hollow, like the silence that follows a storm when you're still waiting to discover what's been destroyed. My husband Robert was limping across the hallway, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone trying to hide pain. His left eye was swollen, a deep purple bruise spreading across his cheekbone like spilled wine on white fabric. There were scratches on his forearms, angry red lines that looked fresh, and his usually neat gray hair was disheveled, sticking up at odd angles as if he'd been running his hands through it for hours. "Robert?" I dropped my overnight bag by the door, my voice catching in my throat. "My God, what happened to you?" He looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold more than physical pain. There was something broken in his expression, something ashamed and desperate that I'd never seen before in 35 years of marriage. For a moment, I thought he might speak, might explain the injuries that made him look like he'd been in a car accident or fallen downstairs. Instead, he just shook his head slowly and continued his painful journey toward our bedroom, each step a study in careful endurance. "Robert, please," I called after him, but he disappeared into our room and closed the door with a soft click that somehow felt more final than if he'd slammed it. That's when I heard the music, loud, aggressive rock music pumping from upstairs, Lucas's room. Our 17-year-old son, who usually greeted me with at least a grunt of acknowledgement when I returned from work trips, was barricaded behind his bedroom door with music turned up so loud the windows in his room were probably vibrating. I climbed the stairs, my legs heavy with exhaustion and growing dread. Each step felt like I was walking deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The music was so loud it seemed to pulse through the walls, through my chest, making it hard to think clearly. I knocked on Lucas's door, first gently, then more insistently as the volume drowned out any sound I could make. "Lucas!" I shouted over the noise. "Lucas, I'm home! What's going on?" The music stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence that felt almost worse than the noise. I heard footsteps, and then the door opened just wide enough for my son to appear in the gap. But this wasn't the Lucas I'd left 3 days ago. His dark hair, usually messy but clean, looked like he hadn't washed it in days. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from crying or lack of sleep I couldn't tell. There were scratches on his knuckles, and his favorite t-shirt was wrinkled and stained. "You're back," he said flatly, as if commenting on the weather rather than greeting his mother after a 3-day absence. "Lucas, your father is hurt. He's limping. He has bruises. What happened? Was there an accident?" Something flickered across my son's face. Guilt, maybe, or anger, or something I couldn't identify. He looked past me toward the stairs, then back at my face with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, distant. Like he was looking at a stranger, rather than the woman who'd raised him, who'd sat by his bedside through fevers and nightmares, who'd cheered at every baseball game and helped with every difficult homework assignment. "Not my problem anymore," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not my problem anymore, as if his father, our family, was something he could simply walk away from, something disposable and unimportant. I stood there in the hallway, looking at this young man who carried my eyes and his father's stubborn chin, trying to understand how the child I'd nursed and nurtured had become this cold stranger. "What do you mean, not your problem?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Lucas, he's your father. Whatever happened, ask him," Lucas interrupted, already stepping back into his room. "Ask him what he did." Before I could respond, before I could demand a real explanation, or insist that he tell me what had torn our family apart in the 3 days I'd been gone, he closed the door. I heard the lock click, followed immediately by the music starting again, even louder than before. I stood there in the hallway of my own home, feeling more lost and frightened than I'd ever felt in my life. Something terrible had happened between the two most important men in my world, and neither of them would tell me what it was. I was being shut out of my own family's crisis, treated like an outsider in the house where I'd spent decades creating a home built on love and trust and communication. If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. I walked slowly back downstairs, my mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had they fought? Had something happened with Lucas's friends? Something that put Robert in harm's way when he tried to intervene? Was my son in some kind of trouble that had somehow involved his father? The scratches on both of their hands suggested physical confrontation, but I couldn't imagine what could have driven them to violence against each other. Robert and Lucas had always had their differences. What father and teenage son didn't? But they'd never been physical. Robert was patient, thoughtful, the kind of man who solved problems with conversation rather than confrontation. Lucas could be moody and difficult, like most teenagers, but he'd never shown any signs of real aggression, especially not toward his father. I tried the bedroom door, but it was locked. I knocked gently, then more firmly. "Robert, please. I need to know what happened. I need to know that you're okay." Silence. "I'm scared," I admitted through the door, my voice breaking on the words. "I come home to find you hurt, and Lucas acting like he doesn't even know us. Please, just tell me what's wrong." More silence. So complete I began to wonder if he'd somehow left the room without my hearing. But then I caught the sound of quiet movement, the creak of our bed springs, the soft rustle of fabric. He was there, conscious and mobile, just choosing not to respond to his wife's pleas for information about his injuries. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of our bedroom door and tried to remember when I'd last felt this helpless, this excluded from the lives of the people I loved most. Even during Lucas's difficult early teenage years, when communication had been strained and emotions ran high, we'd never had silences like this. Even during the rough patches in my marriage, when work stress or financial worries had created tension between Robert and me, we'd never stopped talking entirely. This was different. This was the kind of silence that felt intentional, punitive, like I was being punished for something I didn't understand, excluded from knowledge that somehow everyone else possessed. It was the silence of secrets, of guilt, of shame too deep to speak aloud. Standing there in my own hallway, locked out of my own bedroom by my own husband, with my own son treating me like an unwelcome stranger, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart. That would have been cleaner, more dramatic. This was rawer, messier, like the sound of old wood splintering under too much weight. It was the sound of trust breaking, of assumptions crumbling, of a world I thought I understood revealing itself to be built on foundations far more fragile than I'd ever imagined. I was Teresa Rodriguez, 60 years old, a retired nurse who'd spent her career helping other people through their worst moments. I'd held hands with dying patients, comforted grieving families, and maintained professional composure through medical emergencies that would have sent most people into panic. I thought I understood crisis, thought I knew how to handle whatever life might throw at me. But nothing had prepared me for this. The crisis in my own home, involving the people I loved most, where my skills and experience and compassion meant nothing because no one would let me close enough to help. As I stood there in the growing darkness of evening, listening to the muffled sounds of my family's pain echoing through closed doors, I realized that sometimes the worst wounds are the ones you can't see, can't treat, can't even understand. Sometimes the people you love most become strangers overnight, and all your years of caring and sacrifice and devotion count for nothing when they decide you're not worthy of their trust. But I was still their wife, still their mother, and whether they wanted my help or not, I wasn't going to stop fighting for them, or for the truth of what had shattered our family while I was away, caring for someone else's mother in her time of need. The next morning brought no relief, only a deeper understanding of how completely my family had fractured while I was away. I woke up alone in the guest room, having spent the night on the narrow single bed that we usually reserved for visiting relatives. Robert had never unlocked our bedroom door, and I'd finally given up waiting and retreating to the small room down the hall, where I lay awake most of the night, listening to the house settle around me, and wondering how everything I thought I knew about my life had become so uncertain. I made coffee with hands that trembled slightly, a side effect of too little sleep and too much anxiety. The kitchen felt strange in the morning light, not because anything had changed physically, but because the atmosphere had shifted so dramatically that even familiar spaces felt foreign. The breakfast table where we'd shared thousands of meals together sat empty, the chairs pushed in with military precision as if no one had eaten there in days. When Robert finally emerged from our bedroom, he moved with the same careful gait I'd noticed the night before, favoring his left side and wincing slightly when he thought I wasn't looking. He'd managed to shower and dress in clean clothes, but the bruises on his face had darkened overnight, painting his features in shades of purple and yellow that made him look older, more fragile than his 62 years should have allowed. "Good morning," I said softly, pouring him a cup of coffee in his favorite mug, the blue ceramic one Lucas had made for him in middle school art class, slightly lopsided but treasured because of its origins. Robert accepted the coffee without meeting my eyes, wrapping his hands around the mug as if seeking warmth despite the fact that the morning was already growing warm with the promise of another hot day. He sat at the table, but not in his usual chair. Instead, he chose the seat that faced away from the stairs, away from any possibility of seeing Lucas if our son decided to come down for breakfast. "How are you feeling?" I asked, settling into my own chair and trying to catch his gaze. "Those bruises look painful. Maybe I should take a look at—" "I'm fine," he interrupted, his voice hoarse and flat. It was the first time he'd spoken to me since I'd come home, and the words carried no warmth, no invitation for further conversation. They were a wall, not a bridge. I studied his profile as he stared into his coffee, noting the way his jaw was set in a hard line, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of pain both physical and emotional. This was not the Robert I'd married, not the gentle man who'd held my hand through my mother's final illness, who'd celebrated every small victory in Lucas's childhood as if our son had conquered the world. This was a stranger wearing my husband's face, carrying wounds I wasn't allowed to understand or help heal. "Robert," I tried again, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage. "I know something terrible happened while I was gone. I can see that you're hurt, and I can see that something's wrong between you and Lucas, but I can't help if you won't tell me what's going on. I'm your wife. We're supposed to face things together." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Pain, maybe, or regret. I thought he might speak, might finally bridge the gap that had opened between us. Instead, he pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the silent house. "Some things can't be fixed, Teresa," he said quietly, not looking at me. "Some things are just broken." He left his coffee half-finished and limped toward the living room, leaving me alone at the breakfast table with questions that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. I heard the television turn on, the volume set deliberately loud enough to discourage any attempt at further conversation. The morning news anchor's cheerful banter about weather and traffic felt obscenely normal in contrast to the crisis unfolding in my own home. When Lucas finally appeared, it was nearly noon, and he looked even worse than he had the night before. His hair was greasy and unkempt, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd gotten about as much sleep as I had, and there was something wild and desperate in his expression that scared me more than his coldness had the previous evening. He moved through the kitchen like a ghost, opening the refrigerator and staring at its contents without really seeing them. I watched him from the doorway, this young man who'd once run to me with every scraped knee and broken toy, who'd trusted me with his childhood fears and adolescent anxieties. Now he seemed determined to pretend I didn't exist. "Lucas," I said softly, stepping into the room. "Honey, please, just tell me what happened. Whatever it is, we can work through it together. That's what families do." He pulled out a carton of orange juice and drank directly from it, a behavior that would normally have earned him a gentle reprimand about manners and consideration for others. Today, it felt like another small act of rebellion, another way of rejecting the family values I'd tried to instill in him. "We're not a family anymore," he said, his voice harsh and angry in a way that cut through me like glass. "Families don't do what he did. Families don't lie about everything for years and then act like the injured party when the truth comes out." "What truth?" I asked, moving closer despite the warning in his posture. "Lucas? What truth? What did your father lie about?" But Lucas was already moving toward the door, the orange juice still in his hand, his whole body radiating the kind of restless energy that suggested he was barely keeping himself under control. At the doorway, he paused and looked back at me with an expression that mixed pity with something that might have been contempt. "Ask your perfect husband," he said. Ask him about the promises he broke and the trust he destroyed. Ask him about the 18 years of lies he's been telling us both. The door slammed behind him, and I heard his footsteps on the stairs, followed by the slam of his bedroom door and the immediate blast of music that had become his preferred method of communication, or rather, of avoiding communication entirely. 18 years of lies. The phrase echoed in my mind as I stood alone in the kitchen, trying to make sense of words that seemed designed to hurt rather than inform. What could Robert have been lying about for 18 years? What promises could he have broken that would drive our son to violence and our family to this terrible silence? I thought about our marriage, about the life we'd built together, searching for signs I might have missed, clues that might explain Lucas's accusation. Robert had always been a private man, someone who processed difficulties internally before sharing them with others. But lies? Broken promises? I couldn't reconcile those words with the man I'd shared a bed with for over 3 decades, the man who'd been my partner through career changes and family crises, and all the ordinary challenges that test a marriage's strength. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unanswered questions and careful avoidance. Robert remained in the living room, channel surfing without apparent interest in anything he found. Lucas stayed barricaded in his room, emerging only for brief trips to the bathroom that he timed to avoid any possibility of encountering his father. I moved between them like a mediator in a war where no one would tell me what the fighting was about, offering food that no one wanted and conversation that no one welcomed. I tried calling my sister Maria, thinking that maybe talking to someone outside the situation might help me gain some perspective. But how could I explain what I didn't understand? How could I ask for advice about a crisis I couldn't even define? Everything's fine, I heard myself saying when Maria asked how the family was doing. Just the usual teenage drama with Lucas. You know how it is. But this wasn't usual. And it wasn't the typical friction between a father and his teenage son. This was something deeper, more destructive. Something that had poisoned the very air in our house and turned the people I loved most into strangers who could barely stand to be in the same room with each other. That evening, I attempted one more approach. I knocked on Lucas's door during a brief lull in his musical fortress, my heart pounding as I prepared to demand answers rather than simply ask for them. "Lucas, I'm coming in," I announced, turning the doorknob before he could lock it again. His room was a disaster. Clothes scattered across the floor, empty food containers on every surface, textbooks and papers scattered as if he'd swept them off his desk in a fit of rage. Lucas himself was sitting on his unmade bed, staring at his phone with the vacant expression of someone who was physically present but emotionally absent. "Get out," he said without looking up. "No," I replied, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "I'm not getting out, and I'm not leaving you alone until you tell me what's going on. I'm your mother, Lucas. I've earned the right to know why my family is falling apart." For the first time since I'd come home, he looked directly at me, and what I saw in his eyes broke my heart. Pain, yes, but also disappointment so deep it seemed to have aged him years in just a few days. He looked at me like I was complicit in whatever betrayal he believed Robert had committed, like my ignorance was somehow evidence of my guilt. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "All these years, and you really have no idea who you married. Then tell me," I pleaded, sitting on the edge of his bed, despite his obvious reluctance to have me there. "Help me understand. Whatever your father did, whatever happened between you two, I need to know. I can't fix what I don't understand." Lucas studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether I was genuinely ignorant or simply pretending not to know something I should have figured out long ago. Finally, he shook his head and turned away. "It's not my story to tell," he said quietly, "and even if it was, I don't think you'd believe me. You've spent so many years seeing what you wanted to see that I don't think you're capable of seeing what's actually there." His words were like a physical blow, suggesting that I'd been willfully blind to problems in my own home, that my love for my husband had somehow made me complicit in whatever harm had been done. I wanted to argue, to defend myself and my marriage and my judgment, but sitting there in the wreckage of my son's room, looking at the pain in his young face, I began to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe I had been seeing what I wanted to see. Maybe the signs had been there all along, and I'd simply chosen to ignore them. "Lucas," I whispered, reaching out to touch his hand, but he pulled away from me, the rejection swift and complete. "Don't," he said. "Just don't." I can't deal with your disappointment too. Not right now. As I left his room and walked slowly back downstairs, I realized that somehow, in the space of just 2 days, I'd become the enemy in my own home. Both my husband and my son were treating me like an adversary, someone to be avoided and shut out, rather than someone who might offer comfort or help. The woman who'd devoted her life to caring for others had become unwelcome in her own family's crisis. I was being punished for crimes I didn't understand, excluded from solutions to problems I couldn't identify. And the worst part was the growing suspicion that maybe, just maybe, I deserved it. Days turned into a week, and I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home, trying desperately to find some way back into the lives of the two people who meant everything to me. I cooked Robert's favorite meals and left them warming in the oven, only to find them untouched hours later. I bought Lucas the expensive cereal he liked and left it on the counter where he couldn't miss it, along with a note that simply said, "I love you." The cereal disappeared, but the note remained, crumpled and discarded beside the empty box. I started staying up later, hoping to catch one of them in a moment of vulnerability when they might be willing to talk. I woke up earlier, thinking that maybe the quiet hours of morning would provide an opportunity for honest conversation. But Robert had developed the ability to move through the house like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without making eye contact or acknowledging my presence. Lucas had perfected the art of existing in the same space, while making it clear that I was invisible to him. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the moments when they forgot to maintain their walls completely, when I caught glimpses of the pain they were both carrying, and realized how thoroughly I'd been shut out of it. I'd find Robert standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, his shoulders shaking with what might have been tears, but the moment he sensed my presence, his posture would straighten and the vulnerability would disappear behind a mask of controlled indifference. I'd hear Lucas on the phone with his friends, his voice animated and normal, laughing at jokes and making plans for the weekend. But the instant he became aware that I was nearby, the conversation would end abruptly, and he'd retreat to his room with the speed of someone fleeing a crime scene. It was like living with two people who spoke a language I didn't understand, who shared a secret history that excluded me completely. I began to feel like an intruder in my own life, someone who'd stumbled into a family drama where everyone knew their lines except me. My sister Maria called on Thursday evening, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I considered telling someone the truth about what was happening. I sat in the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to her cheerful chatter about her grandchildren's latest accomplishments, and felt the words building in my throat. My husband won't speak to me. My son treats me like I'm contaminated. My family has fallen apart, and no one will tell me why. But when she paused and asked how I was doing, I heard myself saying, "Everything's fine, just tired from work." The lie came so easily that it scared me. When had I become someone who pretended everything was normal when my world was collapsing? When had I started protecting the people who were hurting me by maintaining the fiction that our family was still intact? "You work too hard, Teresa," Maria said, with the gentle concern of an older sister who'd been watching out for me since childhood. "You need to take better care of yourself. Make sure Robert and Lucas are helping around the house." I looked around the kitchen that I'd cleaned alone every day for the past week, at the meals I'd cooked for people who wouldn't eat with me, at the laundry I'd folded for a family that acted like I didn't exist. The irony of Maria's advice was so sharp it was almost funny. "They help," I said, adding another lie to the growing pile. "We all pitch in." After I hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table and tried to remember when I'd last felt like a valued member of my own family. Had there been signs before I left for Mrs. Henderson's? Had Robert and Lucas been pulling away from me gradually, so slowly that I hadn't noticed until the distance became a chasm? I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Lucas before leaving for my work trip. He'd been stressed about a history project, and I'd offered to help him research and organize his thoughts. "I can handle it myself, Mom," he'd said. Not unkindly, but with a dismissiveness that suggested my help wasn't needed or wanted. At the time, I'd taken it as normal teenage independence. Now I wondered if it had been something else, an early sign that I was already being written out of his life. And Robert? Had he been different in the weeks before I left? I tried to recall our interactions, searching for clues I might have missed. He'd been working late more often, staying at the office for evening meetings that seemed to multiply without explanation. When I'd asked about the extra hours, he'd said something vague about a difficult client and year-end pressures. I'd accepted the explanation without question, trusting him as I'd always trusted him. But now I wondered, had there really been meetings? Or had he been avoiding home for reasons I'd been too naive to recognize? Had the signs of whatever crisis was coming been there all along, visible to everyone except the wife who thought she knew her husband's heart? Friday brought a new kind of torture. Lucas had friends over for the first time since I'd returned home, and I listened from the kitchen as he laughed and joked with them in the living room. His voice was light, carefree, nothing like the cold, angry tone he used with me. I could hear him being the son I remembered, funny, thoughtful, engaged with the world around him. It was like discovering that someone you thought was mute could actually speak perfectly well. They just chose not to talk to you. I brought snacks to the living room, thinking that maybe the presence of his friends would force Lucas to acknowledge me with something approaching normal courtesy. The boys, 3 teenagers I'd known since middle school, looked up at me with the polite smiles that good kids reserved for their friends' parents. "Thanks, Mrs. Rodriguez," said Mike, a sweet boy who'd been Lucas's best friend since elementary school. "These look great." But Lucas didn't look at me at all. He continued his conversation as if I hadn't entered the room, as if the snacks had materialized through some miracle that didn't require his mother's effort or consideration. His friends glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension but too polite to comment on it. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, hoping he might remember his manners, might offer some small acknowledgement of my existence. Instead, he turned slightly away from me, angling his body to make it clear that I wasn't welcome in the conversation. "Let me know if you boys need anything else," I said, my voice sounding artificially bright even to my own ears. Mike and the other boys thanked me again, but Lucas remained silent. As I walked back toward the kitchen, I heard one of his friends say quietly, "Dude, your mom seems cool. Why are you being so weird?" Lucas's response was too quiet for me to hear, but whatever he said ended the discussion immediately. The conversation resumed, but the easy laughter was gone, replaced by the careful politeness of teenagers who'd suddenly realized they were witnessing family drama they didn't understand. Later that evening, after Lucas's friends had gone home and he'd retreated to his room, I encountered Robert in the hallway. For a moment, we stood facing each other in the narrow space between the bathroom and our bedroom, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way the bruises on his face had faded from purple to yellow-green. "Robert," I said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. He jerked away from my touch as if I'd burned him, his reaction so violent and immediate that I stumbled backward into the wall. The look he gave me was pure revulsion, as if my very presence disgusted him. "Don't," he said, his voice raw with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Just don't touch me." The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and confused. In 35 years of marriage, Robert had never spoken to me with such vehemence, never looked at me with such obvious distaste. Even during our worst arguments, even when we'd been tired and stressed and taking our frustrations out on each other, there had always been underlying love and respect. This was different. This was rejection so complete it felt like hatred. "I don't understand," I whispered, pressing my back against the wall as if I could disappear into it. "Robert, I don't understand what I've done wrong. Please, just tell me what I've done so I can fix it." But he was already moving away from me, limping toward our bedroom with the determination of someone fleeing a dangerous situation. The door closed behind him with a soft click, followed by the sound of the lock turning. I stood in the hallway for a long time, replaying the encounter and trying to make sense of his reaction. The revulsion in his eyes had been real, unmistakable. But what could I have done to earn such disgust from the man who'd once promised to love me in sickness and in health, for better or worse? That night, I lay in the guest room bed and tried to remember the last time Robert had touched me voluntarily, not just sexually, but any kind of physical affection. A hand on my shoulder, a brief hug, even an accidental brush of fingers when we passed each other coffee. The harder I tried to remember, the more elusive the memories became, until I began to wonder if it had been weeks or even months since we'd had any kind of meaningful physical contact. How long had he been recoiling from my touch? How long had I been living with a man who found my presence repulsive? And if I'd been blind to something so fundamental about my own marriage, what else had I failed to see? Saturday morning brought a new humiliation. I was in the grocery store trying to focus on the mundane task of shopping for a family that wouldn't eat meals together when I ran into Janet Morales, a neighbor I'd known for 15 years. Janet was one of those women who seemed to know everyone's business in the neighborhood, not out of malice but from genuine interest in the lives around her. "Teresa," she called out, her voice carrying across the produce section. "I was just thinking about you. How are things at home? Everything okay with Robert and Lucas?" The question was innocent enough, but something in her tone suggested she'd heard rumors, gossip that hadn't reached my ears. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, wondering what stories were circulating about my family, what signs of our dysfunction had been visible to neighbors while remaining invisible to me. "Everything's fine," I said automatically, the lie becoming easier with practice. "Why do you ask?" Janet's expression became carefully neutral, the look of someone who'd just realized they'd stepped into dangerous territory. "Oh, no reason. I just noticed, well, Lucas seemed upset the other day when I saw him walking to school, and Robert looked like he might have hurt himself. I saw him getting out of his car very carefully, like he was in pain." She'd seen them. She'd noticed things about my family that I hadn't been around to observe, and her careful tone suggested that whatever she'd witnessed had been concerning enough to generate neighborhood discussion. I was becoming a topic of speculation, the wife who apparently didn't know what was happening in her own home. "Robert pulled a muscle at work," I said, inventing an explanation that sounded plausible enough. "And you know how teenagers are. Everything's a drama at that age." Janet nodded, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. She'd seen something that couldn't be explained away by pulled muscles and teenage mood swings. As we parted ways in the cereal aisle, I caught her looking back at me with an expression that mixed pity with curiosity, and I realized that I'd become an object of sympathy in my own neighborhood. Walking through the rest of the store, I felt like everyone was watching me, wondering about the woman whose family was clearly falling apart, while she smiled and pretended everything was normal. I imagined conversations at kitchen tables and backyard barbecues. "Did you see Teresa Rodriguez? Something's definitely wrong over there. The husband looks like he's been in a fight, and the son won't even make eye contact with his own mother." By the time I reached my car, I was shaking with a combination of anger and humiliation that I'd never experienced before. I'd become a neighborhood curiosity, a cautionary tale about women who didn't pay enough attention to their own families. And the worst part was that maybe they were right. Maybe I had been so focused on taking care of other people's problems that I'd missed the signs of disaster in my own home. As I drove home with groceries that would probably sit uneaten in my refrigerator, I made a decision. I was done being shut out, done accepting silence as an answer, done pretending that everything was fine when my world was clearly falling apart. Whatever Robert was hiding, whatever had driven Lucas to violence and hatred, I was going to find out. I was tired of being treated like a stranger in my own home. It was time to start acting like the woman I'd raised my son to respect, and the wife my husband had once loved. It was time to stop asking for answers and start demanding them. 2 weeks had passed since I'd come home to find my family destroyed, and the fight was slowly draining out of me like water from a cracked vessel. Each day brought new evidence that whatever had broken between Robert and Lucas couldn't be fixed by my love, my persistence, or my desperate attempts to hold our family together through sheer force of will. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, existing but not truly living, moving through routines that had lost all meaning. I stopped cooking elaborate meals that no one would share with me. Instead, I made simple things for myself: toast with butter, canned soup, scrambled eggs, and left the leftovers in the refrigerator where Robert and Lucas could find them if they chose to acknowledge that I'd made the effort. They ate the food, I knew, because the containers would disappear and reappear clean in the dishwasher. But it was like feeding stray animals who would take your offerings while refusing to let you close enough to touch them. The guest room had become my permanent residence, though I still harbored a foolish hope that one morning I'd wake up to find Robert standing in the doorway, ready to apologize and explain and invite me back into the bedroom we'd shared for decades. Instead, I woke each day to silence, to the sound of Robert moving carefully through his morning routine behind our locked bedroom door, to Lucas leaving for school without saying goodbye. I'd started talking to myself, whispering reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. This will pass. Families fight, people heal, love wins in the end. But the words sounded ridiculous even to my own ears. like mantras from self-help books written by people who'd never lived through the particular kind of devastation that comes when the people you love most decide you're not worthy of basic human courtesy. The photo albums had become my refuge and my torture. I'd taken them from the living room bookshelf where they'd sat for years, gathering dust between holiday celebrations and special occasions. Now, I spread them across the guest room bed like tarot cards, trying to read the future in images from the past, searching for signs of when everything had started to go wrong. There was Lucas at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on Robert's shoulders at the county fair. Robert's face was turned up toward his son with an expression of pure adoration, the kind of love that seemed incapable of souring into the cold rejection I witnessed now. What had changed between that moment and this one? What promise had Robert supposedly broken that could transform such obvious devotion into violence and hatred? There was our family vacation to the beach 3 summers ago, the last trip we'd taken together, though I hadn't realized at the time that it would be our final attempt at shared happiness. Lucas was 14 then, still young enough to build sandcastles with his father, still willing to pose for pictures with his arm around my shoulders. We looked like any normal family, sunburned and sandy, and genuinely enjoying each other's company. I studied Robert's face in those photos with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. Had there been signs even then? Some shadow behind his smile? Some distance in his eyes that I'd been too happy to notice? Or had the lies Lucas mentioned been so skillfully maintained that even photographic evidence couldn't reveal them? The wedding album was the most painful to look at, filled with images of a young couple who'd believed they were making promises that would last forever. 25-year-old Teresa in her grandmother's wedding dress, 30-year-old Robert in a rented tuxedo that he'd complained made him look like a penguin. We looked so confident, so certain that love would be enough to carry us through whatever challenges life might bring. I traced the outline of Robert's face in our wedding photo with one finger, remembering how he'd cried during our vows, not from nervousness or social pressure, but from genuine emotion that had surprised us both. He'd whispered, "I love you," during the ceremony, breaking protocol to make sure I heard the words, even though we'd already practiced them during rehearsal. The man in that photograph bore no resemblance to the stranger who now recoiled from my touch, as if I carried some contagious disease. That Thursday evening, I experienced what felt like the final blow to my diminishing hope. I'd been sitting in the living room, pretending to watch television while actually listening for any sound that might indicate Robert or Lucas was ready to talk. The house had been quiet for hours. Robert in our bedroom with the door locked, Lucas in his room with music playing at a volume just loud enough to discourage interruption. Around 9 o'clock, I heard voices from the front yard. Robert was outside, talking to someone in tones too low for me to understand the words, but animated enough to suggest an actual conversation rather than the monosyllabic grunts he'd been offering me. I moved to the window and saw him standing by our mailbox, speaking with Tom Patterson, our next-door neighbor. What struck me wasn't the conversation itself. Robert had always been friendly with Tom, sharing casual discussions about lawn care and neighborhood politics. What devastated me was seeing my husband animated and engaged, smiling and gesturing in ways he hadn't done with me since I'd returned home. He looked like the man I'd married, the man I'd fallen in love with, the man I'd thought I was going to grow old with. But that man, apparently, was available to everyone except his wife. When Robert came back inside, he walked past the living room without acknowledging my presence, though he had to know I was there. The television was on, the lamp was lit, and I was sitting in plain sight of anyone entering the house. Yet he moved through the space as if I were furniture, present but irrelevant, part of the landscape but not worthy of recognition. "How's Tom doing?" I asked, my voice sounding desperate even to my own ears. Robert paused at the foot of the stairs, and for a moment I thought he might actually respond. Instead, he continued climbing toward the second floor without a word, his footsteps careful and deliberate on the wooden steps that creaked in a pattern I'd memorized over decades of living in this house. I sat alone in the living room until after midnight, staring at the television without processing what I was watching, listening to the house settle around me and wondering how someone could feel so completely abandoned while surrounded by the people she loved most. The loneliness was physical, a weight in my chest that made breathing difficult and thinking clearly nearly impossible. Friday brought a ritual that had once been one of my favorite weekly traditions: grocery shopping for our family's weekend meals. For years, I'd planned elaborate breakfasts for Saturday mornings, and special dinners for Sunday evenings, treating the weekend as an opportunity to show my love through food and shared meals. I'd wander the grocery store aisles thinking about what would make Robert smile, what new recipe might tempt Lucas to try something different, how I could create the kind of domestic warmth that made our house feel like a home. Now, I stood in the same store, holding a small basket instead of a cart, buying ingredients for meals that only I would eat. The elderly man ahead of me in the checkout line was purchasing dinner for one: a small piece of fish, a single potato, a container of soup that would provide leftovers for tomorrow's lunch. I recognized the efficiency of solitary living in his choices, the way he'd learned to shop for sustenance rather than pleasure, to feed himself without the joy that comes from feeding others. I was becoming him, I realized. I was learning to live as a single person while technically remaining part of a family. I was adapting to isolation while surrounded by people who'd once depended on my care and attention. The cashier was a young woman who'd checked out my groceries many times before, and she looked puzzled by the dramatic change in my shopping patterns. "Small week?" she asked, with the friendly curiosity of someone who'd grown accustomed to seeing me purchase enough food for a family. "Just me this week," I said, the words coming out more honestly than I'd intended. She nodded politely, but I saw her glance at my wedding ring, perhaps wondering if I was recently divorced or widowed. I wanted to explain that my husband and son were very much alive. They just preferred to pretend I didn't exist. Instead, I paid for my modest groceries and drove home to a house where I would eat alone while the people I loved most avoided sharing space with me. That weekend, I reached what felt like the bottom of my emotional reserves. Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of laughter from the kitchen, real, genuine laughter that I hadn't heard in our house since before I'd left for Mrs. Henderson's. I crept downstairs and found Robert and Lucas eating breakfast together, sharing some joke that had them both smiling for the first time in weeks. The moment they noticed me in the doorway, the laughter died. Robert's expression closed off immediately, returning to the careful neutrality he'd perfected over the past 2 weeks. Lucas looked almost guilty, as if he'd been caught committing some crime by enjoying his father's company. "Good morning," I said softly, hardly daring to hope that this might be the beginning of healing. Neither of them responded. Robert stood up from the table, leaving his breakfast half finished, and walked past me toward the living room. Lucas followed a moment later, taking his plate with him, abandoning the scene of temporary happiness rather than risk having to acknowledge my existence. I stood alone in the kitchen, looking at the evidence of their shared meal: 2 plates, 2 coffee cups, 2 people who'd found a way to connect with each other while completely excluding the third member of their family. They could still be a family, I realized. They just couldn't be a family that included me. That afternoon, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since childhood. I went to the small park 3 blocks from our house and sat on a swing, moving back and forth in the gentle rhythm that had once brought me comfort when the world felt too complicated to navigate. The playground was empty except for a young mother pushing her toddler on the baby swings, both of them laughing as the child squealed with delight. I watched them and remembered pushing Lucas on these same swings when he was small, remembered the weight of his small body in my arms, the trust in his eyes when he looked at me, the way he'd beg for "higher, mommy, higher," until I was afraid he might fly right out of the swing. Back then, I'd been the center of his universe, the person he ran to when he was hurt or scared or excited about something wonderful that had happened at school. Now I was the person he couldn't bear to look at, the woman whose very presence seemed to cause him pain. Somewhere between those carefree afternoons at the playground and this moment of complete rejection, I'd lost my son without even realizing he was slipping away. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of all the beautiful evenings I'd taken for granted when I thought my family would always be together, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I was going to stop fighting for a place in a family that had decided it didn't want me. I was going to stop begging for explanations from people who'd made it clear that I wasn't worthy of honesty. I was going to accept that whatever Robert had done, whatever promises he'd broken, whatever lies he'd told, I was somehow complicit in my own eyes and in the eyes of my son. But I still had something they'd forgotten about, something they hadn't managed to take away from me in their systematic dismantling of our family. I still had my own strength, my own worth, my own capacity for survival. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to remember who Teresa Rodriguez had been before she became someone's wife and someone's mother. Maybe it was time to stop being the woman who begged for crumbs of affection from people who'd decided she didn't deserve a place at their table. Maybe it was time to set my own table and see who was worthy of sitting at it. I walked home from the park as darkness fell, feeling something shift inside me that hadn't moved in weeks. It wasn't hope. I'd used up all my hope. It wasn't anger. I'd exhausted my capacity for rage. It was something quieter but potentially more dangerous. It was resolution. I was done being invisible in my own life. One way or another, I was going to find out what had destroyed my family. And then I was going to decide what kind of woman I wanted to be and whatever came next. The change began on a Sunday morning when I woke up and didn't immediately start planning how to win back my family's affection. For the first time in 3 weeks, I lay in the guest room bed and simply listened, not with the desperate hope of hearing signs that Robert and Lucas were ready to include me, but with the detached attention of someone gathering information rather than seeking reconciliation. I could hear Robert moving around our bedroom, the familiar sounds of his morning routine that I'd listened to for decades. But instead of feeling the usual pang of exclusion, I found myself analyzing what I heard with the clinical objectivity I'd once brought to my nursing work. His movements were careful, deliberate, suggesting his injuries were still bothering him more than he wanted to admit. There was a pause in his routine, longer than usual, followed by what sounded like a heavy sigh. Pain, I diagnosed silently. Physical pain, but also emotional exhaustion. Whatever burden he was carrying, it was wearing him down just as much as it was destroying our family. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than hurt when I thought about my husband. I felt curiosity. What kind of man allows his family to implode rather than explain what went wrong? What kind of secret was so devastating that he'd choose isolation and conflict over honest conversation? And most importantly, what kind of wife had I been that my husband felt he couldn't trust me with whatever truth was eating him alive? That last question stung, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of the familiar wash of self-pity and confusion, I felt something sharper and more useful: analytical interest. I'd spent 3 weeks assuming that Robert's silence was about punishing me for some unknown transgression. But what if it wasn't about punishment at all? What if he was protecting me from something he thought I couldn't handle? The idea should have been insulting. The notion that my own husband might consider me too fragile for honesty. Instead, it felt like the first piece of a puzzle I'd been too emotional to solve. Robert had always been protective of me, sometimes to a fault. He was the kind of man who changed the subject when movies got too violent, who avoided telling me about problems at work that might cause me worry, who handled unpleasant family business without involving me in the details. What if whatever had happened between him and Lucas fell into that category? What if the 18 years of lies Lucas had mentioned weren't malicious deceptions, but protective omissions? Secrets kept not to harm me, but to spare me from knowledge Robert thought would destroy me. I got dressed quietly, choosing clothes with the same deliberate care I'd once used when preparing for difficult shifts at the hospital. Comfortable shoes, practical clothing that wouldn't restrict my movement, hair pulled back so it wouldn't distract me. I was preparing for investigation, not reconciliation, and the difference felt significant. Downstairs, I made coffee and toast for myself, but I also prepared a full breakfast: eggs, bacon, fresh fruit arranged on plates that I set on the kitchen table. Not as a peace offering this time, but as bait. I wanted to observe Robert and Lucas when they thought I wasn't trying to engage them, when they felt safe to be themselves rather than maintaining their walls of rejection. I took my own breakfast to the living room and positioned myself where I could see the kitchen through the doorway while appearing to focus on the morning news. Sure enough, within an hour, Lucas appeared in the kitchen, drawn by the smell of bacon and the promise of a real meal. He moved cautiously, checking to make sure I wasn't lurking nearby, then began eating with the focused attention of a teenage boy who'd been surviving on cereal and sandwiches for too long. When Robert joined him, I saw something I'd missed during my weeks of desperate pleading for inclusion. These two people were hurting just as much as I was. Robert's careful movements spoke of pain beyond his physical injuries. There was a heaviness in his posture, a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. Lucas, despite his cold treatment of me, looked younger and more vulnerable than his 17 years, like a child trying to carry a burden too heavy for his shoulders. They ate in near silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of people who understood each other. It was the careful silence of two people navigating around a subject too dangerous to discuss. They were walking on eggshells with each other just as much as they were with me, I realized. Whatever had fractured our family hadn't left any of us unscathed. "How's your shoulder?" Lucas asked quietly, the first direct question I'd heard him ask his father since I'd returned home. "Better," Robert answered, though the way he rotated his arms suggested otherwise. "The bruising is fading." "I'm sorry," Lucas said, so softly I almost missed it. "I'm sorry I hurt you." Robert reached across the table and briefly touched his son's hand, the first affectionate gesture I'd witnessed between them since this crisis began. "You were angry. I understand angry. But I shouldn't have—" "We both said things we shouldn't have said," Robert interrupted. "We both did things we wish we could take back." The conversation was frustratingly vague, offering hints without substance, clues without context. But it told me something crucial. Whatever had happened between them involved mutual regret, shared responsibility, and love that persisted despite the damage they'd done to each other. This wasn't a story with a clear villain and victim. This was a story about two people who'd hurt each other badly and were struggling to find their way back to solid ground. More importantly, it confirmed that I wasn't being excluded out of cruelty, but out of some misguided attempt to protect me from knowledge they thought would harm me. They weren't my enemies. They were my family members who'd decided I was too fragile to handle whatever truth had exploded between them. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since my teenage years. I went through Robert's personal belongings with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting a criminal investigation. Not to find evidence of affairs or financial improprieties, those kinds of betrayals would have been almost easier to understand. I was looking for signs of the man Lucas claimed had been lying to us for 18 years. I started with his home office, a small room off the living room where he kept his work papers and personal files. I'd always respected his privacy in this space, understanding that everyone needed somewhere that belonged entirely to them. But privacy was a luxury I could no longer afford, and respect was something that had to be earned rather than simply expected. His desk drawers revealed the usual accumulation of office supplies, business cards, and financial documents. Nothing seemed unusual or suspicious until I found a manila folder tucked beneath his appointment calendar, hidden but not locked away. Inside were documents I'd never seen before: legal papers, medical records, and correspondence with agencies whose names I didn't recognize, but whose letterheads suggested serious, official business. I photographed everything with my phone before returning the folder to its hiding place, my hands shaking slightly as I realized I was gathering evidence against my own husband. But I'd tried asking for answers and been met with silence. I'd tried patience and been rewarded with rejection. Sometimes the only way to find truth was to stop waiting for it to be offered and start searching for it yourself. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Instead of retreating to the guest room after dinner, I remained in the living room, openly reading while Robert watched television. I wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't trying to make myself small and unnoticeable in hopes that my family might find me less threatening. When Lucas came downstairs for his nightly raid of the refrigerator, I didn't try to engage him in conversation. Instead, I simply acknowledged his presence with a nod and returned to my book. When Robert got up to change the channel, I didn't offer commentary or try to suggest something we might watch together. I just continued reading, occupying my rightful space in my own home without apology or explanation. The shift was subtle but significant. For 3 weeks, I'd been behaving like a suppliant in my own house, begging for acceptance and inclusion. Now I was simply existing as I had every right to exist, taking up space that belonged to me, refusing to shrink or disappear just because my presence made others uncomfortable. "Teresa," Robert said suddenly, his voice uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since this crisis began. I looked up from my book and waited, neither encouraging him to continue nor discouraging whatever he might be preparing to say. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't desperate to hear his words. I was simply curious about what he might choose to share. But after a moment of apparent internal struggle, he shook his head and returned his attention to the television. The moment passed, but something had shifted. He'd almost spoken to me, not to dismiss me or reject me, but to perhaps begin the conversation we'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. I returned to my book, but I was no longer reading the words. Instead, I was thinking about the woman I'd been before I became so consumed with being the perfect wife and mother that I'd forgotten how to be Teresa Rodriguez, the woman who'd had her own thoughts and interests and strength long before she'd defined herself entirely through her relationships with others. That woman had been a good nurse, calm under pressure, analytically minded, capable of making difficult decisions when other people's lives hung in the balance. She'd been someone who could assess a crisis situation and take action rather than waiting for someone else to fix things for her. Somewhere in the process of loving my family so completely, I'd lost track of the woman who'd been strong enough to earn their love in the first place. I'd become so focused on meeting their needs that I'd forgotten I had needs of my own, so committed to solving their problems that I'd stopped expecting them to consider my feelings. But that woman was still inside me, I realized. She'd been dormant, not dead. And maybe it was time to wake her up. "I'm going to bed," Robert announced around 10 o'clock, his tone carefully neutral. "Good night," I replied, not looking up from my book. He paused in the doorway, perhaps expecting me to say something more, to make some gesture toward reconciliation or at least acknowledgement of the distance between us. When I didn't, he continued toward the stairs, but his footsteps were slower than usual, almost hesitant. Lucas appeared a few minutes later, grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen. As he passed through the living room, he glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or confusion at finding me calmly occupying space rather than desperately seeking his attention. "Good night, Lucas," I said simply. He stopped, apparently as startled by my matter-of-fact tone as Robert had been. For a moment, I thought he might respond, might offer some small gesture toward normal interaction. Instead, he nodded briefly and continued upstairs, but the nod felt significant, an acknowledgement of my existence that I hadn't received in weeks. I sat in the living room until nearly midnight, reading and thinking and gradually feeling something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Peace. Not happiness. That would come later if it came at all. Not satisfaction. That required resolution that was still far off. But peace with myself, with my right to exist and think and act independently of my family's approval or disapproval. For 3 weeks, I'd been fighting for a place in a family that had decided it didn't want me, but I'd been fighting the wrong battle. I didn't need their permission to exist, their approval to have worth, their inclusion to have value. I needed answers, yes, and I deserved honesty, but I didn't need to beg for either. It wasn't anger anymore that was driving me. It was something quieter, but more powerful. It wasn't pain, though pain was still there. It wasn't hope, because hope required trust I no longer possessed. It was decision. Cool, clear, unstoppable decision. I was going to find out what had destroyed my family, and then I was going to decide what kind of life I wanted to build from whatever pieces remained. But I was done being a victim of other people's choices, done allowing my worth to be determined by people who'd forgotten my value. I was Teresa Rodriguez, and it was time to remember what that meant. The documents I'd photographed from Robert's office told a story I wasn't prepared to understand, but one that confirmed my growing suspicion that the lies Lucas had mentioned weren't simple deceptions. Medical records spanning years, legal consultations with specialists I'd never heard of, correspondence with government agencies whose acronyms meant nothing to me, but whose official letterheads suggested serious, long-term involvement in something that had required professional guidance. I spent Monday morning at the public library, using their computers to research the agencies and medical terms I'd found in Robert's hidden files. What I discovered made my hands shake so badly I had to stop typing and sit back in the hard plastic chair, staring at the screen while the full magnitude of what my husband had been carrying alone began to sink in. This wasn't about affairs or financial fraud or any of the betrayals I'd imagined during my weeks of desperate speculation. This was about something far more complex and devastating, something that explained not just Robert's secrecy, but his apparent belief that I needed to be protected from the truth. The medical terminology alone suggested conditions and treatments and prognoses that would terrify any spouse, any mother, any woman who thought she understood what the future held for her family. But what struck me most wasn't the medical details I was still struggling to comprehend. It was the dates on the documents. This had been going on for years. Years of appointments I'd never known about, consultations I'd never been included in, decisions being made about our family's future without my knowledge or input. Robert had been managing a crisis of unimaginable proportions while maintaining the fiction that everything in our lives was normal and manageable. The woman I'd been 3 weeks ago would have confronted him immediately, demanding explanations and apologies, insisting on her right to be included in decisions that affected her life. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone who understood that knowledge was power, and that power needed to be accumulated carefully before it could be wielded effectively. I drove home with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before this nightmare began. But it wasn't the frantic energy of someone trying to force solutions to problems she didn't understand. It was the calm determination of someone who'd finally identified the real battle and was preparing to fight it with strategy rather than emotion. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since my mother's death 5 years earlier. I called her sister, my Aunt Carmen, who'd raised 7 children and buried 2 husbands, and somehow emerged from decades of family crises with her wisdom and humor intact. Carmen was 83 years old, sharper than most people half her age, and possessed of the kind of practical insight that came from surviving more than most people could imagine. "Mija," she said when she heard my voice, using the endearment that always made me feel like I was still the young woman who'd come to her for advice about everything from cooking to marriage. "You sound different, tired, but not defeated. What's happening?" I told her everything, not just about the past 3 weeks, but about the documents I'd found, the research I'd done, the growing understanding that my family's crisis was rooted in something far more serious than the emotional betrayals I'd initially suspected. Carmen listened without interrupting, making only small sounds of acknowledgement that let me know she was processing every word. "So," she said when I finished, "your husband has been carrying a secret that's been eating him alive for years, and your son found out about it in a way that made him feel betrayed, and both of them think you're too fragile to handle whatever truth they've been living with." "That's what it looks like," I admitted. "And how does that make you feel? Angry that they didn't trust you with the truth, or grateful that they were trying to protect you?" The question caught me off guard because I realized I felt both emotions simultaneously, along with a dozen others I couldn't easily name. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm angry that I've been excluded from decisions about my own life, but I'm also scared of what I'm going to find when I dig deeper. What if they were right? What if I'm not strong enough to handle whatever they've been hiding?" Carmen was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd survived every crisis life could throw at a woman and emerged stronger rather than broken. "Teresa, when your mother was dying, do you remember what you did?" I did remember. I'd taken a leave of absence from work, moved into my parents' house, and spent 3 months managing her medical care with the kind of focused competence that had surprised even me. I'd navigated insurance companies and medication schedules and treatment options, making decisions when my father was too grief-stricken to think clearly, advocating for my mother's comfort and dignity when medical professionals seemed more concerned with procedures than with patients. "You became the strongest person in that room," Carmen continued, "not because you weren't scared or heartbroken, but because you decided that someone needed to be strong and you were the best person for the job. Your husband and son have forgotten who you are, Mija. Maybe it's time to remind them." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen and thought about the woman I'd been during my mother's final illness. She'd been calm under pressure, analytically minded, capable of making difficult decisions when other people were too emotional to think clearly. She'd been someone who could look at impossible situations and find ways to make them bearable, who could advocate for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. That woman hadn't disappeared when my mother died. She'd simply been dormant, overshadowed by the more familiar roles of wife and mother that had seemed more important than the independent strength that had once defined me. But she was still there, waiting to be called upon when circumstances required someone who could handle crisis without falling apart. Tuesday evening brought the first sign that Robert and Lucas were beginning to notice the change in me. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for myself with the same care I'd once devoted to family meals, when Robert appeared in the doorway. He stood there for several minutes, watching me cook with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That smells good," he said finally, his voice tentative in a way that suggested he wasn't sure how I'd respond. "Thank you," I replied, not turning away from the stove. I wasn't being deliberately cold, but I also wasn't rushing to fill the silence with reassurances or invitations. If he wanted to have a conversation, he was going to have to do more than comment on cooking smells. "Teresa," he said, and something in his tone made me look at him directly for the first time in days. "I want you to know that none of this is about you. What's happening between Lucas and me, the way we've been, it's not because you did anything wrong." It was the most he'd said to me since I'd come home, and the closest thing to an explanation I'd received in 3 weeks. But instead of feeling grateful for the crumb of information, I found myself analyzing his words with the same clinical detachment I'd brought to difficult medical cases. "I know," I said simply. He seemed surprised by my response, perhaps expecting tears or demands for more information, or at least some acknowledgement of how difficult these weeks had been for me. When I simply returned to my cooking, he remained in the doorway, apparently uncertain how to proceed. "I've been trying to protect you," he said after another long pause. "I know that too," I replied, still not turning around. "But protection without consent is just another form of control, Robert, and I'm tired of being controlled by people who think they know what's best for me." The words came out more clearly than I'd expected, carrying a conviction that surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. I wasn't pleading or accusing, I was simply stating a fact about what I was and wasn't willing to accept going forward. Robert stood in the doorway for another minute, then walked away without saying anything else. But I could feel something shifting between us, some acknowledgement that the woman he'd been trying to protect was no longer the same woman who'd left for Mrs. Henderson's house 3 weeks ago. Wednesday brought an even more significant development. Lucas came home from school and found me in the living room, reading medical journals I'd checked out from the university library. I'd spread them across the coffee table with the systematic organization of someone conducting serious research, and I could see his eyes taking in the titles and subject matter with growing concern. "Mom," he said, and it was the first time he'd called me anything other than avoiding my name entirely since I'd come home. "What are you reading?" I looked up at him calmly, noting the worry in his expression, the way he seemed younger and more vulnerable when he wasn't actively maintaining his walls of rejection. "I'm educating myself," I said simply, "about things I should have known about years ago." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear about what I might be discovering. He sat down on the edge of the couch, farther away from me than he would have sat a month ago, but closer than he'd been willing to come since this crisis began. "Mom, you don't understand. There are things that would change how you see everything, things that would hurt you." "Lucas," I said, closing the medical journal and giving him my full attention. "I'm a 60-year-old woman who spent 30 years as a nurse. I've seen people die. I've held families together through unimaginable crises, and I've learned that the truth is almost always less devastating than the lies we tell ourselves to avoid it. What could possibly hurt me more than watching my family fall apart while everyone refuses to tell me why?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with something, the desire to maintain his protective silence warring with the growing recognition that I might be stronger than he'd given me credit for. "He made me promise," Lucas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. When I confronted him about it, he made me promise not to tell you. He said it would destroy you, that you'd blame yourself, that you wouldn't be able to handle it." "And do you believe that?" I asked gently. "Do you think I'm too weak to handle whatever truth you've been carrying?" Lucas looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than his 17 years, and for the first time since I'd come home, I saw not anger or rejection, but exhaustion and pain that mirrored my own. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "A month ago, I would have said yes. You always seemed so fragile when it came to family stuff, like you needed us to be perfect so you could feel safe. But watching you these past few days, you're different, stronger, more like—" He paused, struggling to find the words. "More like myself?" I suggested. He nodded. "Yeah, more like the mom who used to take care of everyone when things got scary. I'd forgotten that version of you existed." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the significance of this moment. For the first time in weeks, my son was seeing me as someone who might be capable of handling difficult truths rather than someone who needed to be protected from them. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now," I said, reopening the medical journal with deliberate calm. "I continue learning what I need to learn. And when I'm ready, we're going to have a family conversation about whatever's been destroying us. All three of us, with all the cards on the table. And if it changes everything? If the truth is something that can't be fixed or forgiven? I looked at my son, this young man who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders, who'd been trying to protect me even while pushing me away, and felt something settle into place that had been displaced for weeks. Then we'll deal with that too, I said firmly. But we'll deal with it together, as a family that trusts each other enough to face hard truths. Because whatever your father has been hiding, whatever promises were broken or lies were told, we're stronger together than we are apart. And I'm done letting fear make that choice for us. Lucas nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd come home, I saw something in his eyes that looked like respect. Not the automatic deference of a child to his mother, but the genuine respect of one adult for another, who'd proven herself capable of handling whatever life might throw at her. The old Teresa would have pushed for immediate answers, would have demanded that he break his promise to his father and tell her everything right now. But I wasn't the old Teresa anymore. I was someone who understood that some battles were worth waiting for, that some truths needed to be arrived at through patience and strategy rather than emotional demands. I was ready, but more importantly, they were beginning to see that I was ready, and that, I knew, would make all the difference when the moment finally came for our family to face whatever had been hiding in the shadows for so long. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening, 3.5 weeks after I'd returned home to find my family shattered. I hadn't planned it that way. Some truths have their own timing, their own momentum that builds until silence becomes impossible to maintain. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard raised voices from the living room, not the careful whispers that had characterized most of Robert and Lucas's recent interactions, but actual argument with real emotion behind it. "I can't keep doing this," Lucas was saying, his voice tight with the kind of frustration that had been building for weeks. "She knows something's wrong. She's been researching, asking questions. Mom isn't stupid, Dad. She's going to figure it out anyway. And when she does, it's going to be worse because we lied to her about it. She doesn't need to know," Robert replied, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried weeks earlier. "Some things are better left." "Better for who?" Lucas interrupted. "Better for you? Because it's not better for me, carrying this secret and watching her blame herself for why we're treating her like garbage. And it's not better for her, thinking she did something wrong when the truth is that you've been lying to both of us for years." I turned off the stove and walked quietly toward the living room, not to eavesdrop, but to finally claim my place in whatever conversation was about to happen. I'd spent 3 weeks being excluded from decisions about my own life, and I was done allowing other people to determine what I was or wasn't strong enough to handle. When I appeared in the doorway, both men fell silent, caught between their argument and their instinct to protect me from its content. But something in my posture, the way I stood with my shoulders back and my chin raised, the way I looked at them with calm expectation rather than desperate pleading, seemed to communicate that the time for protection had passed. "Lucas is right," I said simply, walking into the room and taking a seat in my favorite chair, the one I'd been avoiding for weeks because it felt too much like claiming territory in a house where I'd been made to feel unwelcome. "I do know something's wrong, and I have been researching. So why don't you tell me what I've already figured out, and then we can discuss the parts I'm still missing." Robert looked at me with an expression that mixed fear with something that might have been relief, the look of a man who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. Lucas moved to sit on the couch, positioning himself where he could see both his parents, ready to mediate or intervene if the conversation became too volatile. "Teresa," Robert began, then stopped, apparently struggling with how to begin a conversation he'd been avoiding for years. "The medical records in your office suggest a genetic condition," I said calmly, deciding to remove the burden of explanation from him and simply present what I'd learned. "Something serious enough to require regular monitoring and consultation with specialists. The legal documents suggest it's something that could affect Lucas's future. Medical power of attorney papers, genetic counseling recommendations, information about disability benefits and long-term care options." Robert's face went white, and Lucas made a small sound that might have been surprise or relief that the secret was finally being spoken aloud. "The dates on the paperwork suggest this has been going on for at least 5 years, I continued, my voice remaining steady, despite the way my heart was racing. "Which means you were diagnosed with something serious when Lucas was 12 years old. and you've been managing it without telling me. What I haven't figured out yet is why you thought I couldn't handle the truth, and what happened 3 weeks ago that made Lucas find out in a way that led to violence between you. Mom, Lucas said quietly, it's not just that Dad's sick. It's what kind of sick, and what it means for— He looked at his father, apparently still bound by whatever promise had kept him silent for weeks. Tell her, Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. She already knows most of it. Tell her the rest. Lucas took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he needed to get them all out before he lost the courage to continue. Dad has Huntington's disease. It's genetic, which means there's a 50% chance I inherited it. He's been hiding the symptoms for years, going to doctors alone, making decisions about treatment without telling us. 3 weeks ago, I found some papers he'd left out. Test results showing his condition is progressing faster than expected. When I confronted him about it, about the lying and the secrecy and the fact that I might have the same disease and deserve to know so I can make informed decisions about my own life, he told me that you couldn't handle the truth, that you were too fragile, that it would destroy you. The words hit me like physical blows, each revelation more devastating than the last. Huntington's disease. I knew enough about it from my nursing background to understand the implications. The progressive neurological degeneration, the loss of motor control and cognitive function, the inevitable decline that would steal the man I loved piece by piece over the coming years. And the genetic component meant that my son, my 17-year-old son, who should be worrying about college applications and prom dates, was living with the possibility that he'd inherited a death sentence from his father. I got angry, Lucas continued, his voice breaking slightly. I said things about how he'd stolen our right to make informed decisions, how he'd been lying to us for years about something that affects all of our lives, and he said that some lies were necessary to protect the people you love, that you were happier not knowing, that ignorance was a gift he was giving you, and I hit him. I was so angry about the lying and the patronizing attitude and the way he was treating you like you were too weak to handle your own life that I lost control and hit him. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Robert's labored breathing and Lucas's barely controlled tears. I sat in my chair, processing information that explained everything, the secrecy, the arguments, the way they'd both been treating me like I was made of glass rather than flesh and blood and backbone. How long? I asked Robert, my voice surprisingly steady. How long have you known? 5 years, he admitted, not meeting my eyes. The symptoms started slowly, small things I thought were just stress or aging. By the time I got a definitive diagnosis, I'd already decided that you didn't need to carry this burden. You were so happy, so optimistic about our future. I thought I could manage it alone, that maybe I could protect you from the worst of it. And the progression? I asked, already knowing from my research what the answer would be but needing to hear it from him. Faster than expected, Robert said quietly. The doctors think I have maybe 5 good years left before the symptoms become too severe to hide. Maybe 10 years total before— He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I looked at my husband, this man who'd been carrying the knowledge of his own decline while trying to maintain the fiction that our life was normal and secure, and felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with the anger or hurt I'd been expecting to feel. Instead, I felt the calm clarity that had always come over me during medical emergencies, the ability to see past emotion to what needed to be done. Lucas, I said, turning to my son, you understand that there are tests available to determine whether you inherited the gene, that you can choose to know or choose not to know, but that the choice is yours to make. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I want to know. I need to know so I can plan my life accordingly, but Dad thinks I should wait, that I'm too young to handle that kind of information. And Robert, I said, looking at my husband with the direct gaze of someone who was done being treated like a child, you understand that by hiding this from me, you've stolen 5 years of our marriage, 5 years when I could have been supporting you, helping you navigate treatment decisions, making plans for our future based on reality rather than fantasy. Robert finally met my eyes, and what I saw there was shame so deep it was painful to witness. I was trying to protect you, he said again, but the words sounded hollow now, like a prayer he'd repeated so often it had lost all meaning. You were trying to control me, I corrected gently but firmly. You decided what I could and couldn't handle without giving me the chance to prove you wrong. You treated me like I was too weak to be your partner in the most important crisis our family has ever faced. I was scared, he admitted, his voice breaking. I was scared that if you knew, you'd see me differently, that you'd start treating me like an invalid, that every mistake or moment of confusion would become evidence of my decline. I was scared that knowing would change everything between us. It has changed everything between us, I said quietly, but not the way you expected. I stood up and walked to where Robert sat on the couch, his shoulders shaking with the weight of secrets he'd finally released. I sat beside him, close enough that our knees touched, and for the first time in weeks, I reached out to take his hand. I'm not angry that you're sick, I said, feeling the tension in his fingers, the way he seemed afraid to believe that I was touching him voluntarily. I'm angry that you didn't trust me enough to let me help you carry this. I'm angry that you made decisions about our family's future without including the people who love you most. But mostly, I'm angry that you've wasted 5 years trying to protect me from something I was always strong enough to handle. Mom, Lucas said softly, are you okay? Really okay? I looked at my son, this young man who'd been carrying adult burdens while still trying to navigate the normal challenges of adolescence, and felt my heart break for all the ways we'd failed him in our attempts to protect each other. No, I said honestly, I'm not okay. I'm terrified about what this means for your father's future, for our family's future. I'm angry about the time we've lost and the decisions that were made without me. I'm worried about the choices you're going to have to make about genetic testing and what those results might mean for your life. I paused, taking a breath before continuing. But I'm also relieved that we're finally telling the truth to each other. I'm grateful that we still have time to face this together, time to make real plans based on real information, time to love each other without the barrier of secrets standing between us. Robert was crying now, deep, silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere he'd been keeping locked away for years. Lucas moved to sit on his other side, and for the first time since I'd come home, the three of us were occupying the same space without walls or pretense or careful avoidance. What happens now? Lucas asked, echoing the question he'd posed to me just days earlier. Now we stop lying to each other, I said firmly. Now we start making decisions as a family, with all the information on the table. Now we figure out how to love each other through something that's going to be harder than anything we've ever faced. I looked at both of them, my husband who'd tried to carry an impossible burden alone, my son who'd been forced into adult knowledge and responsibility before he was ready for it. And we start by acknowledging that we're all stronger than we thought we were, and that love doesn't mean protecting people from difficult truths. Love means trusting people enough to face those truths together. The conversation continued deep into the night, covering practical matters like treatment options and genetic counseling and financial planning for an uncertain future. But the most important healing had already begun, the restoration of honesty, the rebuilding of trust, the recognition that we were better together than apart, even when being together meant sharing burdens that none of us wanted to carry. For the first time in weeks, when I went to bed that night, it was in my own bedroom, with my husband beside me, not because everything was fixed. It would never be truly fixed, but because we were finally facing our problems as partners, rather than as people too afraid to trust each other with the truth. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our home on a Saturday morning, preparing breakfast for my family, with hands that moved confidently and purposefully. The morning light streamed through windows I'd cleaned the day before, illuminating a scene that would have looked familiar to anyone who'd known us before the crisis that had nearly destroyed us. But everything was different now, built on foundations of honesty rather than the shifting sand of protective lies. Robert sat at the table, his movements slightly more careful than they'd been a year ago, but his eyes clear and focused on the newspaper spread before him. The tremor in his left hand was more noticeable now, one of the symptoms we no longer pretended didn't exist. But he'd learned to adapt with the grace of someone who'd stopped fighting a battle he couldn't win and started focusing on the battles he could. Lucas appeared in the doorway, dressed for his weekend job at the community center where he'd been volunteering with children who had special needs. At 18 now, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced adult decisions and emerged stronger rather than broken. The genetic test results, which had taken him 3 months to decide he was ready for, had been negative. He would not develop his father's disease, But the experience of living with uncertainty had changed him in ways that made him more compassionate, more purposeful, more aware of how precious ordinary moments could be. "Morning, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of a son who no longer took his mother's strength for granted. "Dad says you have news about the support group." I smiled, stirring the eggs that would soon feed the family I'd fought so hard to keep together. The support group had been my idea, born from the recognition that our experience, families dealing with genetic diseases, spouses learning to navigate progressive illness, children facing uncertain medical futures, was not unique. There were others who needed what we'd learned about honesty, about trust, about the difference between protection and control. "Dr. Martinez thinks we're ready to expand," I said, feeling the satisfaction that came from turning personal pain into something that could help others. "She wants us to consider training other family advocates, people who can help newly diagnosed families avoid some of the mistakes we made." Robert looked up from his newspaper, and the smile he gave me carried gratitude that had deepened over the months we'd spent rebuilding our marriage on stronger ground. "You'd be good at that," he said simply. "You've always been good at helping people through impossible situations." It was true, though it had taken me 60 years and a family crisis to fully understand it. The woman who'd been a skilled nurse, who'd advocated for her dying mother, who'd somehow found the strength to hold her family together when everything seemed lost, that woman had always been there. She'd just been buried under years of thinking that love meant making herself smaller, less demanding, more accommodating to other people's needs and fears. The support group met on Thursday evenings in the community room of the local library, a circle of folding chairs occupied by people at various stages of the journey we'd started 6 months earlier. There was Margaret, whose husband had early-onset Alzheimer's and who was learning to grieve the man he'd been while loving the man he was becoming. There was David, a 35-year-old father whose children might inherit the genetic condition that was slowly stealing his mobility and who was struggling with how much information to share and when. And there was Patricia, a woman my age, whose husband had been hiding his Parkinson's diagnosis for 2 years before their daughter discovered medication bottles in his briefcase and forced the truth into the open. Patricia reminded me of myself 6 months ago, angry, hurt, feeling betrayed by the person she'd trusted most, but beginning to understand that the betrayal had been born from love rather than malice. "The hardest part," Patricia said during our most recent meeting, "is feeling like I missed 2 years of our marriage. 2 years when I could have been helping him, supporting him, making decisions together. Instead, I was living in a fantasy while he carried this terrible burden alone." "The time isn't lost," I found myself saying, speaking from the authority of someone who'd walked that particular path and emerged on the other side. "The marriage you had during those 2 years was real, even if it was built on incomplete information. And the marriage you're building now, based on honesty and shared knowledge, can be stronger than anything you had before, if you choose to make it that way. But how do you forgive the lying? How do you trust again when someone you love has been deceiving you about something so fundamental?" I looked around the circle at faces that reflected different stages of the same struggle: anger, hurt, fear, and underneath it all, love that persisted despite feeling betrayed by the people they cared about most. "You start by understanding the difference between lying to hurt and lying to protect," I said. "My husband wasn't trying to deceive me for his own benefit. He was trying to spare me from knowledge he thought would destroy me. He was wrong about my strength, about my right to make informed decisions about my own life, about what I needed from him as a partner. But his motives came from love, even if his methods came from fear. And then you decide whether you want to spend your energy punishing someone for their mistakes or building something better with the time you have left. Because with progressive diseases, time becomes the most precious thing you have, and wasting it on anger and resentment is a luxury none of us can afford." The words felt true as I spoke them, distilled from months of working through my own anger and hurt to find something more useful on the other side. I'd learned that forgiveness wasn't about excusing Robert's choices or pretending they hadn't hurt me. It was about refusing to let those choices define the rest of our marriage. That evening, driving home from the support group, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that terrible night when I'd come home to find my family shattered. The woman I'd been then, desperate for inclusion, begging for scraps of affection, willing to accept blame for problems she didn't understand, felt like a stranger now. The woman I'd become was someone who spoke her mind clearly, who demanded honesty even when it was uncomfortable, who took up space without apology and expected to be treated as an equal partner in all decisions that affected her life. She was someone who could look at impossible situations and find ways to make them bearable, who could advocate for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. More importantly, she was someone who understood that love wasn't about protecting people from difficult truths. It was about trusting them enough to face those truths together. At home, I found Robert in his study, working on the memoir he'd started writing at my suggestion. It was partly therapeutic, a way for him to process his own fears about the future, but it was also practical. I wanted Lucas to have his father's words, his perspective on life and family and what mattered most, preserved in writing for the years when Robert might not be able to express those thoughts clearly. "How was the meeting?" he asked, saving his work and turning to give me his full attention. "Good," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk that had become my regular spot during our evening conversations. "Patricia is starting to understand that anger is just another form of grief, and grief is just love with nowhere to go. She'll get there." Robert nodded, then reached for my hand with the deliberate care that had become his way of managing the tremor that made fine motor control increasingly difficult. "I've been thinking about what you said last week about the advocacy training. I want you to know that I think you should do it, even if it means traveling, even if it means time away from home. 6 months ago, the old Robert would have made that decision for me, or would have found subtle ways to discourage me from pursuing opportunities that might take me away from his side. The new Robert, the one who'd learned that trust was a two-way street, understood that supporting my independence was part of supporting our marriage. I want to do it," I said. "But I also want to make sure we're making that decision together, with full information about how it might affect your treatment schedule and our family plans." It was a small moment, but it represented the fundamental shift that had saved our marriage. The recognition that love meant making decisions together, with honesty and mutual respect, rather than making decisions for each other, based on assumptions about what the other person could or couldn't handle. Later that night, as we got ready for bed in the bedroom we'd shared for decades but had reclaimed only months ago, Robert spoke the words that had become our evening ritual. "Thank you," he said quietly. The same words he'd said every night since the evening when everything had finally come into the open. "For what?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "For being stronger than I gave you credit for fighting for us when I was too afraid to fight for myself, for showing me what love actually looks like when it's not hiding behind fear." I looked at my husband, this man who was losing pieces of himself to a disease neither of us could control, but who was learning to trust me with his vulnerability rather than trying to protect me from it, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you fought for something worthwhile and won. "Thank you," I said in return, "for finally letting me love you the way you deserved to be loved all along, for learning that I'm strong enough to be your partner in this, not just your protected dependent." We'd learned, perhaps later than we should have, that the strongest marriages aren't built on the absence of problems, but on the willingness to face problems together with honesty and trust. We'd discovered that love doesn't mean shielding people from difficult realities. It means believing in their strength to handle those realities and standing beside them while they do. As I turned off the bedside lamp and settled into sleep beside the man I'd chosen to love through sickness and health, through truth and deception, through fear and hope, I thought about the woman I'd been just 6 months earlier. She'd been someone who measured her worth by other people's approval, who accepted exclusion as the price of maintaining peace, who believed that love meant making herself smaller to accommodate other people's fears. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that dignity was not negotiable, that respect had to be mutual to be meaningful, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable someone else's destructive choices. I'd learned that the silence of acceptance was not the same as peace, and that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for people you loved was to force them to face truths they'd been avoiding. I'd discovered that being strong enough to handle difficult realities wasn't just about personal resilience, it was about refusing to let other people's fears limit your own possibilities. Most importantly, I'd learned that love wasn't about finding someone perfect to share your life with. It was about finding someone willing to grow, to change, to face hard truths, and to build something better together from whatever pieces remained after the storms had passed. As sleep began to claim me, I smiled in the darkness, thinking about tomorrow's plans, Another support group meeting to plan, another family to help navigate the treacherous waters of chronic illness and genetic uncertainty. Another opportunity to use the strength I'd fought so hard to reclaim. I'd learned that sometimes the best thing you could do with pain was transform it into something that could help others. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do with betrayal was forgive it without excusing it. And sometimes the most powerful thing you could do with love was refuse to let it be diminished by fear. I was Teresa Rodriguez, and I had learned that while you couldn't always control what happened to you, you could always control how you chose to respond. I had chosen strength over bitterness, growth over stagnation, truth over comfortable lies. And in making those choices, I discovered that sometimes the woman you become in your darkest moments is exactly the woman you were meant to be all along. Sometimes it takes losing everything you thought you knew about yourself to find out who you really are. I was still a wife, still a mother, still a woman facing an uncertain future with a family forever changed by illness and loss. But I was also something I'd forgotten I could be. I was myself, complete and uncompromised, strong enough to love, and strong enough to demand love in return. And that, I'd learned, was more than enough to build a beautiful life on, whatever challenges tomorrow might bring.